We'll stay in Germany this week for another serial killer, but we'll rewind the clock a bit more to meet a man who lost his mind, but his head was kept. The Butcher of Hanover, Fritz Hans. He had other names too, as serial killers often do: the Vampire of Hanover, the Wolf of Hanover, the Wolf Man. His real name, though, was Friedrich Heinrich Karl Hermann. Prior to World War II, Germany had a death penalty. One thing you should know. It is less well known that, like France, Germany often carried out executions by guillotine back in those days. You might also be aware that executions were carried out quickly. There was no sitting around waiting for decades of appeals courts, just sentence and then get her done. For old Wolfman Fritz, it was barely 4 months between his sentence and his execution. What did the man do to deserve such a harsh penalty as having his head removed from his body? Well, for 6 years between 1918 and 1924, he terrorized the men and boys of Hanover in a way that makes John Wayne Gacy seem mild by comparison. Unlike many serial killers, Fritz seemed to have a rather idyllic childhood. He had 5 siblings to play with, and though he did not really engage with children in his neighborhood or at school, he was spoiled by his mother and took up hobbies like needlework and cooking. He preferred his sister's dolls to traditional activities for boys. That did not seem to bother the family. The father, on the other hand, the womanizer who ignored equally all of his children. He left school early and started locksmithing, but then decided to enlist in the military instead. World War I was still more than 15 years away when he joined. He did fairly well as a soldier at first, but he soon began to have medical issues that were diagnosed as equivalent to epilepsy. He asked for a discharge, and that was granted. He went home to Hanover and worked in his father's cigar factory for a short time. He did all of that before his 16th birthday, when the first criminal problems would begin. In July 1896, he was arrested for luring a boy into a cellar and sexually abusing him. More similar charges would follow until he was committed to a mental institution at Hildesheim in early 1897. Back then, psychologists had more power, and one of them ordered that Fritz be confined to a mental institution indefinitely, with a diagnosis of incurably deranged. Not sure Fritz liked that too well, because by January 1898, Fritz escaped, helped by the mother who so spoiled him, and he ran away to Zurich. He lived with his mother's family there and took up handiwork at a shipyard. He would come back, though, after about 16 months away, and when he did, he became engaged to a woman named Erna. The very next year, despite being escaped from a mental institution, he was notified that he would have to complete Germany's compulsory military service. He went back to the military, where he behaved as an excellent soldier, but he collapsed again and had to be hospitalized for 4 months. Out again was he. He went back to the cigar factory, where he then sued Papa because he was unable to work. That didn't go over very well. There was a nasty fight between Papa Hermann and Fritz, and that ended thusly: no more lawsuit, no charges against the father. The father, however, would sue the son the next year for blackmail and try to have him recommitted. Fritz's spoiled childhood had taken quite the turn at this point. So Dad decides to help his son and his son's fiancée settle down by opening a fishmonger shop. The fiancée, though, would break it off, keep the fishmonger shop, and send Fritz to the curb. Fritz couldn't work, or so he claimed, and he couldn't rejoin the army. Going home to the cigar factory did not seem plausible, so what then? Well, Petty thievery, burglary, and con artistry is what. Even when he did get a real job, he would steal from work and end up back where he started. Eventually, it caught up, and he started going to jail. There was larceny and embezzlement and assault and grave robbing. For about 7 years to just after the opening salvos of World War I, he was in and out of jail. He was sentenced to prison for the duration of the war, but because of manpower shortages, he was allowed out daily to work. With the war over and Germany trying to rebuild, Fritz was released for his sentence and stopped in Berlin before moving back to Hanover. It was almost instant, his return to criminal life. He avoided too much jail time by informing to police. He became such a reliable informant that police just sort of, let him do what he wanted, when he wanted. We believe the killing started in 1918, but it might have been sooner. It ended in 1924 with at least 27 young men and boys dead, but there could have been significantly more. In the chaotic aftermath in Germany at the end of World War I, Fritz's criminal know-how and his relationships with police, it's just impossible to say that there were not several more victims. All of the males were between 10 and 22. All had been lured back to one of Fritz's 3 homes. He had a modus operandi for luring the males back. Promise to help you with a problem. You can stay in my home. I have employment for you. Or, as he became famous for, you're under arrest. Sort of typical for lures. Once back at the home, the victim would be fed and given something to drink, and then here's where the Vampire of Hanover comes in. He would bite into the victim's Adam's apple, usually while also strangling him. Several times he inflicted what he called a love bite, biting clear through the Adam's apple and into the trachea of the victim. For those victims we know about, all were dismembered, all were discarded. One was buried and the rest were disposed of in water, either the Liner River or a lake. He took their personal belongings, selling some, gifting some, and keeping some. He had a lover, Hans Grans, who knew what was up. Hans would also sell, gift, and keep some of those possessions. There were rumors that he cannibalized some of his victims and sold some of the flesh as meat, but none of that was ever proven. He should have been caught after murder 1, but he wasn't. He killed 17-year-old runaway Friedel Rotha, and Rotha's friends told police that Fritz was the last person with him. They actually searched his apartment the month following and arrested him for sexual assault on a 13-year-old boy they found there, and probably saved that boy's life. Friedel's head was in the stove during the raid, but it wasn't found. He did 9 months, came out, and regained his position as police informer. He chilled on the homicide, though, at least for a few years. In February 1923, he killed 17-year-old Fritz Franke, and 5 weeks later, he killed 17-year-old Wilhelm Schultz. In May, he killed 16-year-old Roland Hutt, and then 19-year-old Hans Sonnefeld. After Hans, Fritz and his lover moved to a different apartment, but the killings would begin again. There was Ernst Ehrenberg, 13, a neighborhood boy out running an errand, and then Heinrich Struss, 19, and 17-year-old Paul Brunichewski. Fall would come around and 17-year-old Richard Graf was killed, and then 16-year-old Wilhelm Elder. Before October passed, 13-year-old Heinz Brinkmann and 15-year-old Hermann the Wolf were killed. Fritz did not slow down, though. On November 10th, he killed a 17-year-old carpenter's apprentice named Adolf Hanover. In December, Adolf Heines 19 was killed. A number of witnesses would tell police of some connection or other between Fritz and these boys, and yet, going into 1924, Fritz remained free to kill. By the end of 1923, Fritz and his accomplice had already killed 14 boys. With the new year barely begun, Fritz killed Ernst Speicher, 17, and then 20-year-old Heinrich Koch. In February, there was Willy Singer, 19, and Hermann Speicher, 16. For some reason, he seems to have taken March off, maybe to gather possessions and set about selling them or gifting them, or maybe because we have no idea who he killed in March. Either is equally probable. On April Fool's Day, though, he likely killed Hermann Bock. Though he was not convicted, he was in possession of Bock's clothes and other possessions. Adolf Hogreffe, 16, was next, and then rounding out April, there was Wilhelm Appel, 16, and Robert Witzel, 18. In May, there was Heinz Martin, 14, and Fritz Wittig, 17, along with a 10-year-old Friedrich Abeling. Without slowing, June would see Friedrich Koch, who was 16, and then his final victim, 17-year-old Erich de Vries. He might have continued, but for the skulls. They began showing up in the river, and some boys playing in a field discovered a sack of human bones. By June 13th, 1924, 4 skulls showed up on the banks of the Leine River, and another showed up near a mill in Hanover. Rumors had already spread that Hanover had a missing boy problem, and here was evidence of the fates of some of those boys. That brought the locals out in droves. Several hundred decided to search both banks of the river and areas near the river. The searchers would find more human bones and turn those over. The police had no choice at that point but to dredge the entire river in the area through Hanover. The dredge brought up 500 more bones and whole body sections, which doctors would determine came from at least 22 different people. So now, police get suspicious about Fritz, like they shouldn't have been before. Not when witnesses tell them about Fritz, but only after gruesome evidence is dragged up from the river. They decided not to arrest Fritz, bizarrely, but search his residence and put him under surveillance instead, and have 2 undercover male officers follow him around. Bizarrely, he gets into an argument at the train station with a 15-year-old boy. He goes to police officers and insists that they arrest the boy, Karl Fromm, for traveling on forged documents. So they do. They do arrest Karl, and Karl tells them all about how he's been staying with Fritz the last 4 days, and that Fritz has been raping him, sometimes at knife point. Bad choices by Fritz all around. He was arrested the following morning, June 23, 1924, and his siege of the young men of Hanover ended. Now the police are going to search his apartment, where they found so many bloodstains, and where they found witnesses who could talk about the number of teenage boys that came but never went, and about all the property that did not belong to Fritz and where he hid it. They collected all of the property and then invited all of the parents of missing boys throughout the country to come and look at the items. And they would come. They would identify the property belonging to their children. Fritz would try to deny a direct connection at first, but having the property of so many missing and murdered boys in the possession of one man, well, that was a little overwhelming. He would try to lie and confound and talk around, but by June 29th, he was done with the attempts to get away with it. He broke down, and with his sister urging him to tell the truth, he confessed to the killings. He would try to excuse it as not intentional murder, but accidental, having the urge to bite the Adam's apple during sex. He wanted sympathy for the 8 days he fell ill after his first murder, and the fact that he found dismemberment distasteful. Police knew he was only confessing to those murders for which they had some direct evidence. He would tell them, though, that there were more murders than they knew of, and that the real number of victims was at least 50, probably closer to 70. Let's not forget the accomplice lover either. Hans Grans was also arrested, and the two would stand trial together for 27 murders. The judge would initially allow the public access to the trial, but by day 3, the gruesome details were just so much, and he closed the courtroom. It would not be only Fritz and Hans in hot water. The police were heavily scrutinized, examined, and criticized for all they knew and for failing to stop the killings. It is unclear how much or how quickly things changed for police in Hanover after that trial, though. What is clear is that Fritz was found guilty of 24 murders and sentenced to death by beheading. Fritz took it well and said he was happy to go to the guillotine. Grans, however, was hysterical. He was found guilty of incitement to murder for the death of Adolf Hanover, and accessory to murder in relation to Fritz Wittig. He received 12 years imprisonment for Wittig, but he received a death sentence for Hanover. While Fritz did not appeal, Grans did, and Grans lost. And so on April 15, 1925, Fritz Harman, one of Germany's worst serial killers, was executed by guillotine at the prison. His brain was removed and examined, and then his head preserved in formaldehyde at a medical school. That was cremated in 2014. The remains of all of his victims that were recovered, at least, were buried together in February 1925. The community built a large granite memorial for the boys whose remains are there still. And yet, it was still not over. Before his execution, he penned a letter declaring that Grans was innocent, and that was enough to grant Grans a new trial. He was found guilty again. However, instead of a death penalty, he was given 2 12-year concurrent sentences. He was free, sort of. On release from prison, he was sent to a concentration camp. Germany was then in the midst of World War II. There, Grans stayed until the camp was liberated in April 1945. After the end of the war, he returned to Hanover and lived there until he died in 1975. Aside from the real deaths Fritz caused, an indirect result of his crimes was a regression in LGBTQ+ rights in Germany. Old hatreds resurfaced, and wherever challenged, folks would use Fritz and Grans as a means to shut down the conversation and as an excuse to stereotype and abuse gay men. Stereotypes and excuses that the Nazi Party would jump on to send gay men and women to concentration camps. Thank you for listening, and until next Saturday. If you're enjoying these videos and want more, don't forget to subscribe and turn on your notifications so that you don't miss any videos. Thank you for watching. We really appreciate it.